Okay, Johann, at the beginning, would you like to present yourself and talk about your work as a journalist and your past?
Yes, so I'm a British journalist. I've been a journalist for a long time, and I think one of the reasons I was interested in this subject was a very personal one. One of my earliest memories is of trying to wake up one of my relatives and not being able to, and I was just a small child then, so I didn't understand why, but as I got older, I realized we had drug addiction in my family. And when I started to write the book, which was, God, about 5.5 years ago now, slightly arrogantly, before I started, I thought, oh, this is going to be easy. I know loads about this. I had written about it quite a lot as a journalist. Obviously, I'd lived through it with my family. And so I just wrote down a list of quite basic questions, right? We were coming up to 100 years since drugs were first banned in the United States, and that ban was then imposed on the rest of the world. Like questions that I wanted to kind of work through in the book. So they were like, why did we go to war against drug users and drug addicts 100 years ago? Why do we carry on when it seems to be failing so badly? What actually causes drug use and drug addiction? And what are the alternatives to this war on drugs in practice? And when I started to write, I realized I didn't know the answer to any of those questions. And so I realized that I had to kind of go on a journey. And what I wanted to do was really two things. One is to look at the best social science, that's what I was trained in, but also really to sit with people whose lives have been changed either by the war on drugs or by the alternatives to the war on drugs and by addiction and ways out of addiction. So the main thing I learned on this journey, there were so many things I learned, but I think the main thing I learned is almost everything we think we know about this subject is wrong. Drugs are not what we think they are. Addiction is not what we think it is. The war on drugs is not what we think it is. And as your work has shown really powerfully, the alternatives to the war on drugs are not what we're told they are either. So it's kind of exciting and daunting to realize this is a subject where almost everything we think we know is wrong.
And also you go to Penn State University and you have the access to the papers of Hari Henslinger. And Henslinger is a really important man in the prohibition. He's kind of father of prohibition. You can talk about Henslinger a little bit?
Yeah, so I opened the book with a story related to him.
Yeah.
In 1939, Billie Holiday, the great jazz singer, walked on stage in Midtown Manhattan, and she sang for the first time a song that I think a lot of your viewers will know.
Strange Fruit.
Strange Fruit. It's a song against lynching. It's an extraordinary song. And she stood there and she sings this incredibly powerful song against white supremacy. And that night, she received a warning from a man called Harry Anslinger from his agents, which basically said, stop singing this song. So Harry Anslinger was a kind of government bureaucrat, and I think he's basically the most influential person who no one's ever heard of. He invented the modern war on drugs. He was a government bureaucrat, and he took over the Department of Prohibition, the alcohol prohibition.
Yeah, and he was with the alcohol at the beginning, but when the ban of alcohol falls, he needs to work for him and for his boys.
Exactly.
His Federal Bureau of Narcotics.
Exactly. He has this department that's just lost the war on alcohol and wants to find a new purpose. And he really invents the war on drugs. He's the first person to even use that phrase. He invents the modern war on drugs and he builds it around two really strong hatreds that he had. One was a really strong hatred of African Americans and Latinos. He was regarded as crazily racist in the 1920s, which tells you how racist he was. And a really intense hatred of drug addicts, who he said were like lepers, were infectious, and had to be shut away. And Billie Holiday to him symbolized everything that he hated, right? There's an African-American woman resisting white supremacy who also, you know, she had a drug addiction and Harry Anslinger, when she gets this warning, from Harry Anslinger, Billie Holiday basically says, screw you, I'm an American citizen, I'll sing my song. And he really resolves to destroy her, and I tell the story in Tras al Grito, what he does to her, but essentially he has her stalked by an agent. She was so amazing, the agent fell in love with her, but he arrested her, and she's sent to prison, took away singing from one of the greatest singers in the 20th century.
And how can you describe or define harm reduction? What does this concept means for you?
So if you had asked me, 6 years ago, just before I started work on this, what, for example, causes heroin addiction, I would have looked at you like you were a bit stupid, and I would have said, well, heroin addiction, exactly. Heroin addiction is caused by heroin, that's why it's called heroin addiction, right? And we've been told this story since Harry Anslinger's time. It's become part of our common sense. It was certainly part of mine. and it was really surprising to learn that's not true. So the story we've been told is we think if we kidnapped the next 20 people to walk past this building and we injected them all with heroin for a month, at the end of that month they would all be heroin addicts for a simple reason that there are chemical hooks in heroin that their bodies would start to physically need, and they would have this kind of desperate physical longing for heroin. That's certainly what I thought was going on. First thing that alerted me to the fact there's something not right about that is when it was explained to me, in Britain, if you get hit by a car in Britain and you break your hip, you'll be taken to hospital and you'll be given a lot of a drug called diamorphine. Diamorphine is heroin, it's the medical name of heroin. It's much stronger heroin than you're going to buy from a drug dealer because it's medical.
It's pure.
Exactly. People in British hospitals are given that for quite a long period of time. If anyone watching this show has a British grandmother who's had a hip replacement operation, your grandmother has taken a lot of heroin. If what we think about the drug is right, if what we think about addiction is right, that it's caused by the chemical hooks, what should be happening to all these people in hospital in Britain? Some of them, a lot of them, should be becoming addicted. This has been studied, it virtually never happens. And I think when I learned that, it seemed so weird and so contrary to everything I'd been told. To be honest, I just refused to believe it. And I only really began to understand it when I went to Vancouver and I met an extraordinary professor of psychology there called Bruce Alexander. And Bruce explained to me, the theory of addiction we have that it's caused by the chemical hooks comes from a series of experiments that were done earlier in the 20th century. Your viewers could try these experiments at home if they feel a bit sadistic that day. What they do is you take a rat or a monkey in some of the other experiments, you take a rat and you put it in a cage and you give it 2 water bottles. One is just water and the other is water laced with either heroin or cocaine. If you do that, the rat will almost always prefer the drugged water and kill itself within a couple of weeks, right? So there you go, that's our story. But in the 1970s, Professor Alexander came along and said, well, hang on a minute, we're putting the rat alone in an empty cage with nothing else to do. What would happen if we did this differently? So he built a cage that he called Rat Park, which is basically like heaven for rats, right? They've got loads of friends, they've got loads of cheese, they've got loads of coloured balls, they can have sex, they've got everything a rat can possibly want in life. And they've got both the water bottles, the normal water and the drugged water. But this is the fascinating thing. In Rat Park, they try both the water bottles. Of course, they don't like the drugged water. They don't use it very much. None of them use it compulsively. None of them ever overdose. And I think there's lots of human examples that I'm sure we'll get to about this principle, but I think this tells us something absolutely fundamental about addiction. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. The core of addiction is about not wanting to be present in your life because your life is too painful a place to be. And you know, in some ways we all understand that in our everyday lives. You and I have both got glasses of water in front of us, right? Totally legally, here in Argentina, we could have glasses of vodka in front of us, right? We could both be drinking, we could both be drunk. You and I have probably got enough money, we could be drunk for the next 2 months. We wouldn't end up homeless. We're not going to do that. And the reason we're not going to do that is not because anyone's stopping us. It's because we want to be present in our lives because we've got meaning and purpose and connection. And I think once you understand this insight, and there's many human examples of it that demonstrate it in humans, you understand why the war on drugs, going right back to Hari Anslinger, why it fails so badly. Because the war on drugs is based on the idea that what you need to do with people who have addictions is punish them to teach them not to do it. I want to go back to the beginning of this story because I think there's something really tragic about the Latin American debate at the moment. When drugs were first banned in the United States, what happened is they said within a few years drugs will disappear, right? Drugs did not disappear. And so what Hari Anslinger announced is, the reason they haven't disappeared is because of Latinos. We've got to make that, you might recognize this language from the current American president. The Latinos are bringing it, and what we've got to do is force the rest of the Americas to adopt our war on drugs. And what happened was really visionary. Mexico said, no, we're not going to do that. It hasn't worked in your country. It won't work in our country. No. Instead, they appointed a doctor to run their drug policy, a man called Leopoldo Salazar Viniegra. And he said, this was in the 1920s, he said, we shouldn't ban drugs. Cannabis isn't very harmful. Other drugs, we should give love and support for people. And if we do ban drugs, the whole country will be taken over by armed criminals. If anyone has, we should build a statue to this man, right? And the US government said, get rid of this man. And the Mexicans, to their credit, said, no, we're going to keep him. So the US increased the threats more and more. In the end, what they did, at that time, all legal opiates for painkillers were manufactured in the United States. And so they cut off the supply of legal opiates to Mexico, and people started to die in agony. And Mexico gave in, and the whole course of the 20th century, I think, changed. And what I find heartbreaking about that is to think that all we have to do is go back to what everyone in Latin America knew 100 years ago, right? The people of Latin America resisted the war on drugs. They knew it wouldn't work. So this week when I see your president saying, oh, if only we buy more radars, if only we spend more money, you know, it's worth remembering, right? The United States on the war on drugs, you've got to give them credit for one thing. They've really, really tried it, right? They have spent $1 trillion. They have killed hundreds of thousands of people. They have destroyed whole countries. They've put 2 million of their own people in prison. And at the end of all that, they can't even keep drugs out of their own prisons, where they pay someone to walk around the wall the whole time, right? So ask your president, how is he going to keep them out of Argentina? And I would also ask him, and I mean this is a serious question, can you name one place, one, in the entire 100 years of the global war on drugs where this approach has worked? Just one, right? I can name you loads of places where the alternatives worked. Portugal, Switzerland, Colorado, Washington, the Netherlands, Uruguay. Where's his list? Where did it work?
There's a question really interesting in your book about Switzerland. What can you tell us about this heroin prescription program in Switzerland?
I think you're totally right about to bring that up in the you know, Switzerland had this huge heroin problem in the, as you know, you've reported on as well. Switzerland had this huge heroin problem in the 1980s, and they tried lots of different things. They tried crackdowns, they all failed.
They have open scenes.
Yeah, exactly. They tried kind of forcing the addicts into one particular park.
Spielplatz.
Yeah, it was not a good idea. And in the end, Ruth Dreifuss, who was the first female president of Switzerland, an absolutely extraordinary person, she explained to Swiss people, look, when you hear the phrase legalization, what you picture is kind of anarchy and chaos. What we have now with the drug war is anarchy and chaos. We have unknown criminals selling unknown chemicals to unknown drug users, all in the dark, all filled with violence, disease, and chaos. Legalization, she said, is how we restore order to this violent anarchy. And it's important to understand that legalization doesn't mean, you know, you can't just go into the supermarket and go to the heroin aisle and buy heroin, right? That's obviously not how it works. It's not how anyone wants it to work, or almost nobody wants it to work. What you do is, if you're a Swiss heroin addict, you're assigned to a clinic. You go to that clinic, you know, you've been to them as well. You go at 7 o'clock in the morning because Swiss people believe in waking up early. And you're given your heroin there. You're watched by a nurse or a doctor. And then you leave to go to your job because they give you support to get employment.
And you don't must to work or steal or make prostitution to buy the heroin. The heroin is legal and the state give you the heroin. This is a huge difference because it's cost a lot of money. Exactly. Also, the legal heroin is a bad heroin, but you must pay it.
Exactly, and I think there's a few things that are worth knowing about the Swiss experiment. Firstly, there have been 0 overdose deaths on legal heroin in Switzerland in the more than 10 years they've been doing this. 0. It's worth stressing. Literally nobody has died, right, on the legal program. Secondly, obviously violent heroin dealers are gone, right? No one wants to go to a criminal to get an inferior, more expensive product. At the same time that Switzerland has this terrible crisis, Portugal has this terrible crisis. By the year 2000, 1% of the population was addicted to heroin, which is extraordinary, right? And every year they tried the drug war more. every year the problem got worse. And one day the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition got together and they said, look, we can't go on like this, what are we going to do? They decided to do something super radical, something no one had done since before Harry Anslinger. They said, shall we get some scientists to look at the facts, right? This super radical idea.
Yeah, it's simple, but it's radical in this field.
Exactly, because up until now, drug policy has been built upon ridiculous myths, fears, Victor Lacata-like stories that
it's
turn
not
out to be...
based on evidence.
Exactly.
Normal.
So they set up this panel of scientists led by a wonderful man I got to know called Juan Gulao, who's a doctor. And they went away, they looked at all the evidence, including Rat Park and lots of other stuff, and actually the evidence from Liverpool, which we just talked about. And they came back and they said, decriminalise the lot, decriminalise all drugs, from cannabis to crack. But, and this is the crucial next step, take all the money we currently spend on screwing people's lives up, on imprisoning them, on arresting them, all of that stuff, and spend it instead on turning their lives around. And interestingly, it's not really what we think of as drug treatment. There is some like rehab. But actually the biggest stuff was just a big job creation program. If you used to be a mechanic, they'd go to a garage and they'd say, employ this guy for a year and we'll pay half his wages. The goal was to say to every addict in Portugal, we love you, we value you, you matter, you're important, we're on your side. And by the time I went to Portugal, it was 11 years, since, maybe 12, since that experiment began. The results were very clear. Injecting drug use was down by 50%, having risen consistently before then. Overdose deaths were massively down. HIV transmission was massively down. Street crime was massively down. Something has gone wrong with us, not just as individuals, but as a group. And if we're looking for solutions, we have to look for social solutions. And I think there's a very direct application here in Argentina. So one thing lots of people have asked me about here is about Paco, which is a kind of the kind of detritus of cocaine that's used in a lot of poor parts of Argentina. And there's clearly a very real problem with Paco. And I think when we think about this, it's worth thinking about it through a historical analogy, which helps us to understand why this crisis is happening and why I think what your president is doing will fail disastrously. In the 18th century in England, huge numbers of people were driven out of the countryside into these disgusting urban favelas, basically slums. And at the time, what happened was there was something called the gin craze. It was basically an outbreak of mass alcoholism. Loads of people started drinking huge amounts of gin. There's a famous painting by the British painter Hogarth of I think it's a woman drinking vodka while her baby falls out of a window, right? And this really happened, right? There really was a huge addiction crisis in Britain at that time. And what people said at the time was, look at this evil drug, gin, right? Look at what it does to people, it destroys them. If only we could get rid of gin, things would be better, right? Now when we look back, we see that can't be right. You can buy gin anywhere in England now, and there's no gin crisis, right? Of course, there's some alcoholics, small number, but there's not mass alcoholism. When we look back, what changed? It's not the availability of the drug, it's the social circumstances, right? That people in 18th century England in those slums were deprived of meaning, they were deprived of purpose, they were degraded, they were traumatized, they were forced into terrible circumstances. If we want to understand why there's a Paco crisis in Argentina, and there is, we've got to think about it by analogy with that, right?
With a social crisis.
Exactly. It's not a coincidence that the Paco crisis is happening
2001.
And then it's happening exactly at a time of enormous national trauma, inflicted, by the way, by the rest of the world on Argentina. One of your neighbors, Jose Mujica, who I interviewed when he was the incredible president of Uruguay, who explained to people precisely this, that Latin American countries, because of the supply routes move around the whole time. And he was very conscious, he made, as you all know, extraordinary sacrifices for Uruguay to become a peaceful democracy in his own life. And he was very conscious, if the supply route moves, if Mexico can't defend itself, if Colombia can't defend itself, Uruguay certainly can't. And which is why he began the process of legalization, and he wanted it to go further, precisely because it's the only way to end this violence. The other day I met up with Pablo Escobar's son here in Buenos Aires, We met in a Burger King, which was a bit strange. He's super nice and very intelligent, and he said to me, "You will never find a drug dealer who is in favor of legalizing drugs." It was the only thing his father feared, right? For a very good reason. It's the only thing that stops their violence. When we talk about the alternatives to the war on drugs, very often people talk about it as if this was like an abstract question or like a philosophy question, right? What would it mean? How would we do it? The most important thing to say about this is it is not an abstract question. I've been to the places that have done it. I've tried the alternatives. We can see the results. Emilio, who's a brilliant Argentinian journalist who's in the front row, has done a similar, done similar research for his book A World with Drugs, right?
Would you like to talk us about the meeting with Robert DuPont? This is the creator of the National Institute for Drug Abuse, the NIDA in USA. This is the more important institute of investigation in the fields of drugs, and you meet him in Sweden.
Yeah, so Robert DuPont was the guy that Richard Nixon appointed to set up NIDA. And NIDA now funds 90% of all research into banned drugs in the world, not just in the United States. And it was really weird talking to Robert DuPont because he's a perfectly nice man. He doesn't know anything about addiction. I mean, it was extraordinary. He had never heard of Rat Park. He didn't know the basic research about childhood trauma. He just, rather like you say, it's more like a kind of religious thing. He was there, it was giving this almost religious revivalist speech. It really funds almost exclusively research into addiction that looks at the internal biology of addiction, particularly what happens in the brain. That research is important, it is valuable, it is worth doing. But it's conducted almost in complete ignorance of the social factors that we're talking about, which to me is bizarre. I mean, you could describe the plot of Romeo and Juliet, the William Shakespeare play, through Newtonian physics if you wanted to, right? You could describe the movement of the atoms in Romeo's body and Juliet's body, but you'd be missing the point about what why Romeo and Juliet do anything. And I think in a similar way, by focusing only on the internal mechanisms within the brain and not the society, you miss the point.
Because it's just pharmacology, this aspect of neurobiology. It's just for making new products in pharmacology fields, but just that.
I don't think that's fair. I mean, I think you could imagine using this science in ways other than just to produce new drugs, but it misses the point, right? They fund almost no research into the social... And you know, as you travel, I traveled around the United States a lot, I still do. It's absurd when you go to these places to describe... You know, I was recently in Cleveland, you know, the heart of the Rust Belt, super high levels of addiction. You go around, it's really obvious why people are addicted. Their lives are terrible, right? They have no meaning, no purpose, their values have gone wrong, they're really isolated, they're alone, they're so miserable. And the idea that I would say to one of those people, well, you know, what's gone wrong with you is the following neuroreceptors in your brain are malfunctioning, it would be ludicrous to say that to those people. Now, of course, those brain factors are real, they can make things worse, I'm not disputing that, it's important to say. But the idea that that's the cause is ridiculous. It was just happens to be a coincidence that in the slums of Argentina and in the Rust Belt of the United States, more people's brains are malfunctioning than they are in, you know, the nice bits of Buenos Aires or in Beverly Hills. It's ridiculous to claim that. And yet that is the implicit belief of a lot of the people who follow this science. They get quite close to denying the social causes of addiction. They certainly neglect them. And it's interesting, I interviewed, I didn't use it in the book in the end, but I interviewed a guy called Eric Sterling, who was the lawyer who wrote the drug laws for the United States from 1979 to 1989. So he literally wrote, so the senators tell him what they want, and he literally wrote the words. And he said, you know, it's all ideological. You know, it was never anything to do with science or evidence. And of course, NIDA know that, right? NIDA get their funding from the Congress. And I said to him, what would happen if the head of NIDA, any head of NIDA, announced that actually there were social causes of addiction, that, you know, the kind of things we've been talking about. And he said, Eric Sterling said to me, well, the head of NIDA would know not to do that, right? But if they did, they'd be called before the Congress, and the Congress would say, have you gone mad? And they'd be fired, right? So they've internalized. What I'm saying is inconvenient for power, right? It is inconvenient to power to say addiction is the result of, to a large but not in complete degree, of our society going wrong and our values going wrong and the way we live going wrong. That's very inconvenient to power because it means that we have to change the power structure of our society.
Actually, poorness or...
Yeah, exactly, and but not just poverty, you know. People can be really unhappy for very good reasons because they're obsessed with money, because their values are extremely materialistic. You know, it's very convenient to say, oh, it's just the drugs, right? If only we got rid of these powders and these chemicals, everything would be all right again, right? That's an easy message. You can see why they want to believe it, and you can see why they fund science that tells them. So I think that, just as a last thought, that one of the things that really helped me, you know, I think it's important to say about the war on drugs that I don't think that the impulse for prohibition is inherently evil or irrational. When I look at the people I love who have addiction problems, it is very natural to think, I wish someone would just stop you, right? That is a natural impulse. And it's very natural to be angry. But one of the things I learned is, you know, that approach doesn't work. You can be as angry as you want, it will make the situation worse. Everywhere in the world, policies based on shame and stigma and anger fail, and they make the problem worse. Policies based on love and compassion and regulation make the problem a lot less bad. For 100 years now, we have been singing war songs about drug addicts. I think we should have been singing love songs to them all along. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much for the interview, for taking this time to TECtv and talk about this personal stuff. Also, I know it's hard to talk for private things when you are a writer or a journalist. So.
Especially when you're British.
Yeah, exactly.
I want to thank you, and not just for the interview, obviously, but also for the work that you've done. You know, you've done really important work with your book, documenting that there are alternatives to this war on drugs, that it's not an abstract question, the alternatives have been tried. I think the work you've done is amazing, and you should be really proud of it, and I'm really grateful to talk with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.